I'm Valerie Singleton, and today on Blue Peter we'll be making this lovely cutting oil dispenser. So what we'll need to make this, oh look at the state John and Peter have left this in. So what we'll need is an empty yeast tin, an acid brush, a lump of aluminium, a magnet, some glue, sticky back plastic, and the use of a lathe, but you might need to ask your mother to turn it on for you. That's your childhood ruined. One take, Valerie. Oh, that'll come in really useful, thank you. Hello and welcome to TWEED'S Garage, where in this episode we'll be reassembling the Villiers 9D engine for my 1939 Excelsior Universal. But first we'll have a little bit of modern life getting in the way. Mr. Tweed, why do your videos take so long to come out? Well, you know, life gets in the way, and this was one of those cases. Mrs. Tweed came home from yoga class saying, Mr. Tweed, the car's lit up like a Christmas tree, and it's sort of not running properly. So I had to investigate that. So I thought I'd bring you along and show you a bit of that. I know it's modern stuff, but you know, some of you don't dabble in that, but some of you might find it useful, you know, to give it a crack, save yourself a bit of money. And then the next thing that went wrong was I was trying to I'd filled the PC up with all the video clips for these videos, absolutely stuffed it full, 1 terabyte, nearly full up. So I had to sort of clear it out and sort of trying to do that. And then the connector fell off the board for my external drive. So I had to repair that. So there's a bit of that in there. So come in, see what we've been up to. So the problem with Mrs. Tweed's car is it had the engine management light on, the stability control light and the traction control light. So I needed to investigate those. So the way to do it on modern cars is you need to plug in an OBD diagnostic tool. I've got a basic one of these, which you can get, which work, you know, pretty well. They display the codes on most sort of modern cars, but it only gives you the code. It doesn't give you the meaning of the code, and they come with a booklet. And as you can probably imagine, the booklet gets lost, or you can't find it when you need it, so you have to go on the internet to find what the code means and do it that way. So I reached down under the bench and found my old snap-on scanner that I picked up for a bit of a bargain. So it does the same thing, it reads the codes, but it also has live data on some of the sensors as well. I'm not, you know, 100% au fait with it, but it's mainly the code reader that I use on it. And the advantage of this is it displays the code, but it also displays the meaning of the code as well, to give you a bit of more of a chance of finding the fault. So we took the scanner, plugged it into the OBD2 socket, which on modern cars is normally sort of under the steering column somewhere, or sometimes they're hidden behind an ashtray. So with that connected, we then turned the unit on and got it to connect to the car. So I speeded the video up a bit, but this is the menus you go through to display the on-fault diagnostic codes. And then display the trouble codes. It come up as a P0037, which is heater control circuit low, bank 1 sensor 2, which is the second lambda sensor or oxygen sensor on the exhaust system, which was this lower one. Undoing the clip, disconnecting the connector, and then tucking it out of the way. I did try and get it off with a O2 sensor socket, which is open to one side, but it was starting to twist a bit, so I didn't want to risk rounding it off. So as it looked like it was going to be a problem, I just cut the old sensor off because we weren't going to reuse it. Applied some heat, a bit of WD-40 to cool it down again, and then put a standard socket on and the Makita impact gun. It just it knocked it off in a couple of seconds. So just wound out the old one, and the new one, it was a decent quality one, There was a cheaper option of a Bosch one, but you had to make up the connection yourself, so I'd rather have the proper connection, and it had anti-seize compound on it as well, so you just sort of screwed it in, plugged it in, and off you went. With that done, it was a case of connecting the scanner again, going into the codes, clearing the codes, and then taking the car for a test drive and seeing if that had fixed it, which it had. With the fault code cleared, it was just a case of getting the car into its automatic idle adjustment and letting it run its course and reset the idle, because it had dropped right down a couple of days before to the point that it was stalling every time you pulled up at a junction. With that done, it was all okay, and move on to the next job. Next we tackled the hard drive, so I took it apart, removed the loose connector and the board that it was soldered to, desoldered the original connections, and then reinstalled the connector, soldered the locating tabs, and brushed the soldering iron over the surface mount connectors on the inside of it, which tested my eyesight and my soldering skills, and then put it back together and got that working again so we can clean the PC out. Then we moved on to the crankcases, clearing the oil ways of all the old coke, and just checking it with oil, running it in there and seeing if it ran through okay, which it did, so we could finish cleaning them up and then move on to reassembly. So the first thing to do is take the old shim shield off of the output gear from the gearbox and install the new one. And then grab the new bearing, remove it from its packaging, and then pop out one of the oil seals, because we need it to get lubrication from the gearbox, the gear oil, to lubricate it, but we just want the outer seal to assist the felt seal that's on the output shaft of the gearbox, just to try and stop some of the gearbox oil escaping. Then pop it in the oven and the bearing, then drop the bearing on. That went on really nicely. Give it a little tap home with a copper mallet, and then with the warm crankcases, dropped in the crank, which went in really nicely, and it went in with a clunk, so I thought it had gone all the way home, but it hadn't, and that turned around and bit me in the arse later. So then pushed in the output gear in the gearbox bearing, and then I had to cobble together this sort of arrangement with the old crank tool that I made to push the bearing fully home. It wasn't quite home, so the com rod wasn't in the middle of the join of the crankcase, so, but that went okay. So with the con rod central in the crankcase, it was time to move on. So I cleaned up the gearbox sprocket nut, which was a bit burred up, so cleaned it up with a file and checked the fit in the socket, and then with a piece of old steel plate that I decided to make a locking jig up for the sprocket rather than just jamming it like I did when I took it off. So drilled a hole in the plate to fit over the output housing on the gearbox, glued the plate up, and then scribed around the sprocket onto the plate to give me a guide to cut down to and file to shape. So popped it in the vise and got busy with a hacksaw and files. just filed down to the scribe line and then done a final fitting against the sprocket. Push the sprocket on the output shaft and then slide on the jam plate on the top, line it with the sprocket, and that locked it up nicely. Popped on the nut and then tightened it with a socket wrench. And that worked a treat. And you can see the state of the old sprocket compared to the new sprocket. Then I moved on to the crankcases, where I use this pressurised silicone gasket. It's a bit pricier than the tube stuff, but it's a lot easier to apply once you've got the hang of the trigger and the pressure. You just run a bead around one of the crankcase halves and then spread it out with your finger and clean up all the excess that you don't need. And you end up with a thin smear all the way around, and then with the warmed crankcase half, just pop that down, lined it up on the gearbox studs, and then tapped it home with a rubber mallet. After cleaning the nuts and studs for the crankcases in a bit of kerosene, it was a case of just inserting those all the way around the crankcase and tightening them up. They're a bit of a jiggle because they're a stud with a nut on each side. It was a bit of a fiddle to get the studs evenly through the nuts each side, so that was why I was playing around with it for a bit. So it was aesthetically pleasing and engineeringly correct, as they say. With the crankcase halves tightened together, it was time to install the gearbox. So we started off with the output shaft and its associated gears, and push them home. But you do have to jiggle them around when you put in the lower shaft and the selector fork. So it's just a case of moving stuff backwards and forwards, jiggling it around until you get the sort of home position, and eventually you'll get that sweet spot where you get them all lined up and it will slot home nicely. Having installed the gearbox, we've done the same as we did with the cases with the silicone sealant, ran a smear all the way around and then spread it out with your finger, wiped off the excess and got ready to bolt it on. Now I do know, because I had to take this off, you'll see later in the video, I had to sort of disassemble it again, and it leaves a very thin smear all the way around if you do it this way, which is just right. You don't want tons of it so it overflows all over the place. And this particular one, where it squeezes out of the cases, it cleans off really nicely. Actually, it doesn't spread all over the place. So pop the case on, pop the 6 nuts on, and tighten that all down. Never to be opened again, or so we thought. With the gearbox buttoned up, it was time to fill it up with gear oil, and took out the level plug. Just continued filling it until you get a dribble running out the level plug, and you know you're there. So pop back the level plug, tighten that up, and then put the fill plug back in and tighten that down. So then we moved on to the Kickstart. So you put the spring on, located the one side of the spring in a hole in the gearbox casing with the Kickstart spread open slightly. So then align the Kickstart with the other side of the spring, place it on the splines. Once you put a bit of preload on the spring and you've got it in the right position, and push the Kickstart onto the splines and then tighten it up. On the flywheel side of the crankshaft, there was a lot of burring. There's no keyway on the flywheel side of the crankshaft. It relies on a taper, and obviously at some time or other the flywheel had broken its taper and had been moving around, and unfortunately there was some galling that needed cleaning up. So it was a case of dressing down the high spots with a needle file until we got close to the surface finish, and then with a Japanese whetstone just gradually stone down the high spots back down to the taper. There was still a couple of little high spots that were hard to get down, so with a diamond file just went over those to get those down a little bit further, and then finished off again with the stone. So we ended up with a nice clean taper, so hopefully the flywheel won't move next time we put it on. On the primary chain case, I discovered there was a hole. It looked like it had been there for quite a long time, so cleaned it up with a Dremel, just taking it back to clean aluminium to get past all the old oil and crud that had leaked out of it over the years, and then mixed up this 2-pack metal epoxy. So it comes in a pack as a sandwich lump that you massage together to activate it, and then sort of just press it in like a sort of piece of sticky plasticine. So making sure it sort of gets nice and deep down into the holes and all the ridges, and apply it from both sides, and then just sort of smoothed it over and left it to cure. Once it had cured, it's just a case of filing and sanding it back down to the same profile as the aluminium case. I could have welded it, but experience on the Riley with some of this old aluminium castings is there can be a lot of rubbish in them, and you end up melting away more than you're trying to weld up. So I thought this was as it's not going to get hot and it's not going to be seen, this was the best option, just to stop the oil getting out. But you can see there by my finger, there's like a little lozenge of aluminium to the left of the hole, and it looks like somebody's melted a piece of alley at the factory. So it was obviously had a few holes in it when it was cast. And interestingly, you can see the outline of some countersunk screw heads where the mould maker must have made the mould originally out of a couple of pieces of wood. So it's time for an engineering montage. So I had to make a few pieces. I had to make a new fixing screw for the top of the gearbox casing because it just went walkabout. Can't find it anywhere. Left it, you know, with all the other pieces it's disappeared. So I had to make one of those. And then the stud that holds the primary chain case cover on, the nut come off with the stud. And it wasn't until I sort of jammed it in the lathe really tight and got a spanner on the end of it and undone this that I discovered that somebody had glued it on. And as you can see, I cleaned up the threads, but it's sort of cross-threaded. It goes on at an angle. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, I think you can see that. So we need to turn up a new shaft, a new stud and a new nut. So sit back and enjoy. With the kickstart back together, I discovered there was a clicking noise in first gear and neutral, and suspected that it was the kickstart pull was dragging against the gear that it engages with. So unbolt it and then run a sort of thin feeler gauge round to break the seal of the silicon sealant gasket, which works really well. You just sort of gradually lever it up and run the feeler gauge round, and it just separates the two halves. And I avoided draining the gearbox by laying it over on its side, so I didn't have to drain in the oil. So with access to the kickstart stop, I first centre punched the middle of it because the screw had been peened over to secure it, and then drilled out the middle of it to relieve the pressure, and then just unscrewed it and removed the old kickstart stop, and then placed in the new stop and just compared it with the old one. You couldn't see much difference, it may be in a tiny bit, but that's all it needed. So with that compared, and secured it with a new screw, and then peened that screw over to lock it in place. And it was just a case of reapply, clean off the old gasket, put new silicone gasket on, and then bolt it all back together and wipe it clean. With it bolted back together, I tested it again, and there was no noise in first gear or neutral. So success. Just that tiny difference was enough just to make the pull stick out enough to catch itself on the gear. So with that sorted out, it was just a case of putting the rest of it back together. So put the rear clutch plate back on, then secured it with the nut and tightened it up. These old adjustable spanners done the job really well actually, because they sort of gripped 4 of the posts and rested against the primary chain case stud. So with that locked in place, it was a case of popping on the clutch plate and the primary chain, and then secure the nut on the front sprocket by locking the front sprocket in place. And again, I used a old adjustable spanner because it had 2 lugs that dropped into the gear teeth, and then the back side of it against the stud, and just secured it with the impact wrench. And when tested with a socket, that was nice and tight. Then put in the clutch push rod, then the outer plate of the clutch assembly, followed by the 6 screws and springs, which took a bit of doing. As they were new springs, they were sort of fully extended, so it was a bit of a fiddle pushing the screwdriver against the pressure of the spring getting them started, but got them all done. And then I did phone up and check on this. When I got the bike and took it apart, these screws were wound out quite a way, and I think and they had sort of been wearing a groove in the primary chain case cover. But reading the book, they're meant to be wound, the screws are meant to be wound all the way down to the bottom of those pillars that they screw into. And you think it would collapse the spring completely, but there's a small gap on there. And when I spoke to the Villiers spares people, he said, yep, that's how they're done, but you'll be surprised how it still works. So then, as with the others, just to help the gasket keep the oil in the primary chain case, around a bead of sealant around the inner case, and then a bead around the outer case. Same procedure as before. Run your finger around, smooth it along, and just wipe the excess off. Then pop on the gasket. There is a locating pin on the outer case. You can see the hole there by my thumb. But that was the one that was in there was too short, so I made a new one up and pressed that in and Loctited it in, and then with the gasket in place, pushed the whole assembly together and tightened it up. So once the silicone had cured, I ran a sharp knife around and just trimmed the gasket back a bit as it's sticking out, just to tidy it up. So horrors we mentioned previously in other videos is the spark plug thread had been worked on. It has actually been helicoiled. I think it's been welded as well, but it's just a case of cleaned up. There was a load of flashing around on the inside of the spark plug hole, so just cleaned that up. But it looks okay, fairly decent, so we won't fiddle around with that. We had to mill down the cylinder head because you can see here these marks here. I didn't film it before I started. These little indents here, it was quite badly marked on the top. I'm not too worried about raising the compression ratio a bit because modern fuels, you know, will handle that. At the time, it was very low octane fuel when these were built, so just took a few thou off to clean this up. But around here, you can just sort of see there was a big hole here, and it was right on the joining line between the head and the barrel. And these don't use a head gasket, and in fact the engine uses very few gaskets at all. The gasket set that comes with it, you get a base gasket and a gasket for the primary chain case and the inlet and exhaust gaskets, and that's it. It doesn't have a cylinder head gasket, it doesn't have a crankcase gasket, it doesn't have a gearbox gasket. I've seen a chap on YouTube rebuilding an engine, and he sort of carefully makes new gaskets for all that, but at the time they never had them. If you read the book, they never had them. They just used a gasket sealer and bolted it all together. And the same with the head, it doesn't use a head gasket. You just bolt it down and then run it till it's hot and then tighten it down again, and that should seal it, but we'll see how it goes. So the next job to do was take the glaze off of the bore to help the new piston rings bed in. So I got one of these honing tools off of Amazon, and I've used them before and they work quite well. So just pop that in, bit of WD-40 to help lubricate it, and then you put the hone in, and you need to work out how high you come up. You don't want to come up above sort of halfway on those hinges on the stones, and then the same at the bottom. You don't want them to come out too low because there's a couple of gaps between the cylinder liner at the bottom which will catch the stones. Just worked out my top and bottom position the hone was going to be in, judging it by eye, and then with a squirt of WD-40 run the hone up and down until I've got a nice sort of honing pattern on the bore. And when I was satisfied with the finish, cleaned it up with WD-40 and gave it a good wipe down and got all the grit out, ready to reassemble. So there we go. Let's see, the glaze has been taken off now. It's a nice honed finish in there. I know there's a few scratches in the bore, but it's a vintage 2-stroke that runs with a carburetor with no air filter on, so it's literally, the hole is here, so any dirt goes straight in here, straight into the bore, so you're not going to avoid it, so I'm not too worried about it. It's not as if we're going to be going from Land's End to John O'Groats, or are we? Right, let's get it put together. So a bit of sealing compound on the gasket surfaces, sort of a non-setting gasket sealing compound, so allegedly seals but also makes it easy to get apart. We shall see. Well, hopefully we won't have to take it apart, so we won't see. White coating. Can you guess what it is yet? Oh no, can't say that now, can we? Childhood ruin again. There we go. And of course, using a well vented workshop. Smells rather nasty. Gasket. Just rest that there a minute. Put some on the bottom of the barrel. piston here, the gudgeon pin, oiled ready to go in. Excuse my hat for getting in the way. There we go. Let's use these pliers. These are really handy. A friend of mine, Chris, gave these to me. Hello, Chris. And they're very old CK. I don't know if you can see that, look. They obviously dropped the E and the A off CK. So I don't know how old they are, but they're really good. Right, taking bets for when this shoots across the workshop floor or drops into the bottom. There we go. Turn it that way so that the forces are always pushing the clip open. And then the last flying clip. There we go. It's in. And then it's a case of pushing the gasket down, popping the barrel on, making sure these piston rings line up with their pins. Different to the one I took off, there was one pin here and one pin here, and this one there's one pin there, one pin there. It's to stop the rings, the gaps of the rings, falling into the ports as they go up and down. Right, bear with. There, location pin there, and one there. This is going to be fun. Fiddly fingers time. Oh, not too bad. It's got a nice lead in on the bottom of the barrel. In fact, too nice. Right, let's get that. There we go. What we do is just turn it, make sure the pin's located there. Which it is. What's that? Check the front one. Yep. It's all home lovely. Down we go. There we go, piston in. Find this a lot with British bikes. You have to sort of lift the barrel up slightly to get the nuts on. They don't give you enough clearance. I think we do them up to half grunt tight. There we go. There we go. And then lastly for this video is the cylinder head to go on. I've got to turn some washers up for it, so that's going to take me longer, so I'm going to get on and put the video up for you and put the head on afterwards. The other thing I found with this, there's many problems with this engine. As I said, I did sort of write them down. What do we have? Helicoils in air, helicoil in air, pitted head, worn kickstart stop and damaged kickstart, glued primary case nut, and the head, reading the Villiers booklet, the cylinder head was the wrong way round as well. It was round this way with a spark plug over here and a decompressor this side, but the actual manual says you should have it so that the spark plug is on the output side of the engine. So this way round. So that is what we shall do. So there we go, nearly ready to go back in, but we'll leave that to the next video. And there we go, that's the work done so far. And remember, wear your safety goggles. Now, back to the studio. So there, hang on, wait a minute. I've seen the stats. You'll disappear off now. So, and you miss all the little funny bits at the end. So you're going to have to go back and watch the whole back catalogue all over again, all the way through. No, it's no good moaning and groaning. It's your own fault for being impatient. Okay? Anyway, what's that, Valerie? Something you made earlier? Oh, very nice. Anyway, see you next time. Bye. Bye. God, bloody wig. One take. All right, Valerie? Oh, thanks, Valerie. That will really come in useful. Hello and welcome to Tweed's Garage, where in this episode we'll be... Oh, crap. Crap. This week, so I thought you might have a lot